I was home alone one night during winter break. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes you notice the smallest sounds, like the low hum of the fridge or the occasional creak of old floorboards settling. I was curled up in our sunroom, which is kind of like a smaller living room, a cozy space we mostly use for watching TV or movies. A door on one side led out to the side driveway, though I rarely paid it any attention. That night, I had all the blinds shut and was buried under a warm blanket, half watching some random movie I don't even remember now. It was just background noise more than anything. Then, out of nowhere, the lights outside suddenly flicked on. We have a motion-sensing light by the driveway. It only turns on when something or someone moves past it. And the fact that it had just lit up out of the blue made my stomach drop a little. I instinctively reached for the remote and lowered the volume on the TV, ears straining for any sound. Footsteps, rustling, a voice maybe? But everything stayed quiet. Too quiet. I knew the odds of hearing anything from outside through the windows were slim, but I couldn't ignore it. I hesitated, then pulled back one of the blinds just enough to peek out. A quick glance, nothing. The driveway was empty. The light was still on, casting harsh shadows against the cold pavement, but no movement. No figure, no animal. There's no way to manually shut that light off. It just has to time out on its own. As frustrating as that was, I figured it had to be a false alarm. Maybe a raccoon or a possum scurried by and set it off. That seemed logical enough. Still, the more I thought about it, the less it sat right with me. It didn't feel like an animal. Something about the timing, the stillness, it just didn't add up. So I slipped on my shoes and stepped outside, just to clear my head. The night air hit sharp and cold. I made a slow lap around the driveway, checking every shadow, every corner. No one was there. No sign of anything. At all. Satisfied, or at least trying to convince myself I was, I headed back inside, closed the door behind me, and returned to the sunroom. At least now, I could finish watching TV with a clearer head. Some time had passed, maybe half an hour, maybe less, when I suddenly heard a sharp crash outside. It sounded like a bucket full of something had tipped over and hit the ground hard. The metallic clatter echoed through the stillness, and within seconds, the motion-sensing light outside flicked on again. The first time it happened, I was concerned, but now I was straight up terrified. Something or someone was definitely out there. I clung to the hope that it was just some animal rummaging around, but deep down, I was starting to seriously doubt that. It didn't feel like that kind of situation anymore. I didn't want to move. The couch I was on was actually the only spot in the room not directly visible from the door to the side driveway. It was my one hidden vantage point, and I suddenly became hyper-aware of how exposed I'd be if I stood up. The fear was so real, so immediate, that just the thought of rising and locking eyes with someone standing at that door made my chest tighten. I wanted to turn off the TV, cut the light, cut the sound, but the remote was sitting in the middle of the coffee table, just out of arm's reach. Reaching for it would mean shifting, moving out of my little pocket of safety. Even that slight motion felt risky. Every instinct I had screamed to stay still. My eyes drifted toward the window blinds. They were pulled shut, completely closed, but I wasn't looking at the blinds themselves. I was looking at the silhouette behind them. It was unmistakable. A perfect outline of a person was standing just on the other side of the glass, their figure blurred only slightly by the slats of the blinds. They weren't pressed up against the window, but close enough that their shape was fully visible, arms slightly raised from their sides, fingers maybe spread, motionless, watching. It's hard to describe what I felt in that moment. There was this pressure in my chest and gut, like my entire torso was being squeezed. My heart was thudding so fast it felt wrong, and my breathing became shallow and strained. It wasn't just fear, it was something colder, deeper, like my body had been doused in ice water and every muscle froze in place. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know if I could move. I forced myself up from the couch, every movement deliberate and quiet, as though even the sound of my own footsteps might provoke whatever or whoever was standing out there. My heart was hammering so hard it felt like it might give me away. I had barely made it halfway across the room toward the door that separated the sunroom from the dining room when it happened. The figure on the other side of the window started knocking, no, pounding, aggressively. Each thud against the glass was sharp and jarring, echoing in my skull like a gunshot. My pulse spiked so hard it almost hurt. I froze, panic anchoring me in place. I wanted to scare them off somehow. I wanted to scream, to threaten them, to show I wasn't just going to sit there helplessly. But my voice, when it finally broke free, came out cracked and trembling. I shouted, something like, "I'm calling the cops," but the words felt thin and weak, my fear bleeding through every syllable. For a few seconds, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I stood just inside the doorway to the dining room, listening, holding my breath. And then I saw it. The shadow shifting beyond the blinds, moving toward the side door. When I turned, I caught sight of her through the narrow glass panes. Just for a second. She was an old woman. Wild, tangled hair that stuck out in wiry clumps, her face pale and twisted in some expression I couldn't even begin to understand. For a moment, I felt a flicker of relief, like this is just some unhinged person, not something worse. But that thought barely formed before she began slamming her fists against the glass of the door, over and over, screaming like she had lost her mind. That broke me. I slammed the door to the sunroom shut, locking it, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my voice frantic as I told the operator that some crazy, mental old woman was trying to break into my house. The dispatcher's voice was calm, telling me to stay on the line, to lock myself in a safe room, and to grab something, anything, to defend myself until the officers arrived. I did as I was told, retreating into the bathroom, locking the door, clutching a heavy object like it was my last line of defense. And that's when every nightmare I'd ever had about a home invasion became real. From somewhere outside the bathroom, I heard it, glass shattering. I waited in silence for what felt like an eternity, probably only a minute, listening for anything beyond the bathroom door. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no banging, just a suffocating stillness pressing in from all sides. Slowly, carefully, I turned the lock and eased the door open, barely breathing. Peering out into the hallway, my eyes scanned every shadow until they landed on the living room, and there she was. The old woman with the wild, wiry hair stood in the middle of the room, backlit by the gaping hole of a shattered window. Shards of glass glinted around her feet like ice under moonlight. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring in my direction. And the moment I cracked the door open, she saw me. She rushed the bathroom. I screamed, really screamed, like the terrified 17-year-old kid I was, and slammed the door shut with all my strength. The lock clicked into place, just in time. She began pounding on the door again, relentless, thud after thud. Her fists never let up, and between each strike, she mumbled something, rambling, incoherent words I couldn't understand. Her voice was low, fast, frantic, like a broken record skipping endlessly. I backed up into the corner of the bathroom, trembling, tears running down my face. I was sobbing, begging her to leave, whispering, "Please go away," like a prayer. Then, bang, a loud knock echoed from the front door. Hope. I rushed to the bathroom window, flung it open, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Help!" My voice cracked, but it didn't matter. 2 cops had already made it around to the side and were looking directly at me through the open window. "Stay calm," one of them called. "We're here now." I begged them to come through the broken window in the back. "Just get in here, please." But they waved off the idea, assuring me they'd handle it. "We've got this, stay right where you are." And then, silence. The knocking on the bathroom door stopped. I heard movement outside, footsteps, muffled voices, and then 2 sharp commands. "Ma'am, step away from the door." When I finally stepped out of the bathroom, heart racing, the worst seemed to be over. The 2 officers had the woman pinned and detained on the living room floor. I don't think she resisted much. She just lay there, her face twisted in some unnameable expression, her eyes darting everywhere but never landing long. Just before they pulled her to her feet, she looked right at me. There was something in her gaze I'll never forget, something frenzied, broken, completely detached from reality. I looked away. It turned out she lived nearby, in a rundown house with another woman, someone younger who never left the property and was known around the neighborhood as a bit of a recluse. None of the neighbors really saw her, and no one knew much about either of them. As it turned out, the old woman was severely mentally unstable. She should have been under specialized care, but instead she'd somehow been left to wander freely. My parents pressed charges, not against the old woman, but against her younger housemate. She was supposed to be the caretaker, supposed to prevent something like this from happening, but the legal system didn't see it that way. We lost the lawsuit. Still, there was a strange sense of relief when it was all over. The old woman was finally removed from the neighborhood and placed in a treatment facility, where she should have been all along. At the very least, she was gone. But the image of her standing in our living room, framed by broken glass and moonlight, never really left me. I own a small house tucked away on a large piece of land in the rural part of New York. It's quiet, isolated, the kind of place where you can hear the wind whistling through the trees from inside the walls. I usually head up there a few times a year, especially during the winter months when ski season hits. It's become a little tradition, just me, the cold, and the slopes. There's a neighbor who lives next door, though I've never spoken to them, not once. A wooden fence runs between our properties, tall enough to block most of the view. And beyond the other sides of my house are endless stretches of dense woods, miles and miles of trees with no sign of life. The only other neighbor I've really interacted with lives further down the road, across the street. We'd met a few times over the years. He skis too, so we connected over that. Casual small talk, nothing more. This past January, I made my first trip of the season. As I walked up to the front door, backpack slung over my shoulder, I heard the sound of a kid laughing. It came from somewhere in the direction of the neighbor's house. High-pitched, playful, definitely a child's voice. That caught me off guard. I hadn't known they had kids. Then again, I never really paid much attention to them, so maybe I just never noticed. There's something strange about stepping into a house that's been empty for months. The air always feels a little heavier, stale and still. I had to go through the usual startup routine. Turn on the heat, get the water running, test the lights, check the windows, the kind of chores that make the place feel alive again. That first night, I crashed hard. The 4-hour drive up from Connecticut had drained me, and once I hit the bed, I was out cold, slept like a baby. The next morning, I made breakfast, changed into my ski gear, and got ready to meet some friends at the lodge. As I stepped outside, something caught my eye. A large red ball was sitting in the snow on my front lawn. It was just sitting there, bright against the white, almost perfectly round. I hadn't seen it the day before, and I definitely didn't put it there. My first thought was that it belonged to the neighbor's kids, probably rolled over the fence, I figured. So I picked it up. The plastic was firm, cold, and dusted with snow. I tossed it over the fence without thinking much of it. Then I locked the front door behind me, climbed into my car, and headed off to the ski lodge to meet my friends. We spent the rest of the day skiing. Nothing strange. Not yet. By the time I got back that evening, the sun had long since set. The cold felt sharper in the dark, and the trees surrounding my property loomed like black silhouettes against the sky. I'd had dinner with my friends after skiing, so I was already full and ready to crash. All I wanted was a hot shower and some sleep. But as I walked up the driveway toward the front door, I saw it again. That big red ball. It was sitting in the snow on my front lawn, same spot as before, just resting there like someone had gently placed it down. I stopped, stared for a second. It was starting to feel strange. Still, I tried to shake the unease crawling up my spine. Maybe one of the neighbor's kids had come looking for it while I was gone, tossed it back over, who knows? I didn't want to dwell on it. I picked it up again and threw it back over the fence, harder this time. Then I headed inside and got ready for bed. But sometime in the middle of the night, must have been 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to something that sent a jolt of confusion and fear through me. A child's laughter. It was faint but clear, just outside, high-pitched, playful, and completely out of place. My room was quiet otherwise. No creaking, no wind, just that sound. I sat up, confused, straining to hear. Who would let their kid play outside at this hour, in the freezing cold? It didn't make sense. I got up and walked over to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to peek through. The yard looked still, empty. The laughter had stopped. No movement, no child. Just my breath fogging up the glass. But then I saw it. Down on the lawn, half lit by the porch light, was something small and round. I narrowed my eyes, heart picking up speed. The red ball. Again. Sitting in the exact same spot as before. A chill rippled down my spine. The snow around it was undisturbed, no footprints. Just the ball, waiting there like it had never moved, like it wanted to be seen. This time, I didn't throw it back. I slipped on my slippers and wrapped myself in a robe, then stepped outside into the snow. The cold bit into my ankles as I walked barefoot through the powder, crunching softly under each step. I bent down, picked up the red ball, and stared at it for a long moment. It didn't look any different. No markings, no signs of tampering, but it felt wrong. So instead of tossing it over the fence again, I carried it back inside with me. I placed it on the kitchen counter, turned out the lights, and went back to bed. The rest of the night was quiet. No more laughter. The next morning, before heading out for another day on the slopes, I decided to settle the growing unease gnawing at me. I bundled up and walked over to my neighbor's house, the one behind the fence. For the first time since owning the property, I knocked on his door. It took a few moments before he opened it. He was older than I expected, an elderly man, maybe in his 70s. His posture was a little stooped, but he greeted me warmly with a cautious smile and a polite curiosity, like he wasn't used to visitors. I introduced myself and explained I lived next door. Then, gently, I asked about something that had been bothering me, the sound of a child laughing at night and the red ball that kept ending up on my lawn. He looked at me, puzzled. "There are no children around here," he said, his voice soft but certain. "Not for a few miles at least. No families nearby. Just us older folks." A cold sensation spread across my back. I felt the hair on my arms stand up. I nodded slowly, thanked him for his time, shook his hand, and made my way back to the house, trying to convince myself there was some reasonable explanation. Maybe someone was visiting. Maybe a prank. Maybe I was just overtired. The red ball was still sitting in the living room right where I'd left it the night before. I glanced at it one last time, then headed out. My friends and I spent the entire day skiing again, pushing hard until our legs were shot and the sun dipped low behind the trees. When I got back that evening, I was wrecked, completely drained from the long day and ready to head home the next morning. I tossed my gear and backpack onto the couch without even thinking and told myself I'd pack it all up in the morning. Right now, all I wanted was to collapse. And that's exactly what I did. I hit the mattress like a sack of bricks. My muscles ached and my eyelids felt like lead. Within minutes, I was out. But that peace didn't last. Sometime during the night, I woke up. That laughter again. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. A child's laugh, light, playful, wrong. It echoed through the stillness like it didn't belong, like it had been dropped into the night from somewhere else entirely. I shot out of bed and ran to the window, yanking the curtain open. The yard was dark, blanketed in fresh snow, and there it was, the red ball. Back in the same spot on the lawn, sitting perfectly still. No footprints around it, no trail, no sound, just the ball, waiting. I rushed into the living room, heart pounding, every light now blazing behind me. My eyes locked on the spot where I knew I had left the red ball the night before, on the counter, right next to the sink. But it was gone. I tore the room apart, checking under furniture, behind cushions, even inside cabinets, as if maybe I'd moved it without remembering. But I hadn't. I was sure, absolutely sure. I had left that ball inside, and now it was back outside, sitting eerily still in the snow. That was the moment the fear changed. It wasn't just about some weird ball anymore. I didn't feel alone in the house. Not at all. A thick, invisible pressure settled over me, like the air itself had turned hostile. I ran from room to room, flipping on every light, every switch. I grabbed my bag and started shoving all my wet ski gear into it, still damp and cold. I didn't even fold anything, I just threw it all in. I needed to be ready, in case anything happened. My hands shook as I checked every door, every window. Locked, all of them, just as I had left them. So how the hell had that ball gotten outside? I didn't have an answer. I didn't want one. I left all the lights on, every last one. But when I got back to my bedroom, I turned off only those lights. Just enough to keep myself from going mad, but not enough to feel totally exposed. I went to the window and peeked through the glass again, heart hammering in my throat. And then I saw it. Not just the red ball in the snow, still sitting in that same unnatural position like someone had placed it there with care, but something beyond it. A figure, small, still. A child, standing motionless at the edge of the property, barely illuminated by the porch light, not moving, just staring, facing directly toward my window. I dropped instantly, heart seizing, and yanked the blinds closed in one quick motion. Then I moved through the house, room by room, shutting every blind, drawing every curtain, doing whatever I could to block it out. I crawled back into bed, covers pulled tight, trying to convince myself to just breathe, to just sleep, to pretend none of this was happening. But I couldn't stop seeing it. That small, pale figure standing in the snow. No coat, no hat, just stillness, just silence. I lay there for what felt like hours, unable to blink, every creak of the house making me flinch. And eventually, exhaustion won. At some point, my fear dulled just enough for sleep to drag me under. When I woke up the next morning, the first light of day felt almost unreal. I didn't eat, I didn't even change clothes. I just packed the rest of my things into the car and drove. I didn't look back. Not at the house, not at the yard, not at the red ball that was still sitting there, half sunk into the snow, watching me go. I'd never had anything valuable in that house, nothing worth stealing, and honestly, I didn't care anymore. I just needed to leave. But even now, I can't figure it out. How did the ball get outside? How did whoever or whatever was out there get into my house without a single unlocked door? And that laughter, that child's laughter, it still echoes in my head sometimes, especially on quiet nights. But the worst part, the part that chills me more than anything, is the memory of that child standing out in the snow, unmoving in the dead of night. If that red ball hadn't somehow ended up back outside, if it had stayed in the living room where I left it, I don't know what would have happened. And that's what keeps me up sometimes, because I'll never know. My roommate George and I met through work. We both live about 15 minutes from the office and carpool together every day, which saves us gas money and gives us time to complain about meetings before they happen. Anyway, getting right to the point, about 2 weeks ago we got a new neighbor. At first, we didn't see anyone moving in. No moving trucks, no boxes on the porch, no furniture being carried through the front door. It was like one day the house was empty and the next it wasn't. We didn't even know who had moved in or how many people. Could have been a man, a woman, a whole family for all we knew. But I say he because eventually we did find out. On the third day after we noticed the car parked in the driveway, George and I decided to walk over and introduce ourselves. Just a casual neighborly hello. We rang the doorbell, waited, nothing. No footsteps, no sound behind the door. But the car was still there, parked in the driveway, which meant someone was home. Maybe they just didn't feel like answering, we figured. Fair enough. We were heading back down the driveway when George suddenly slowed his pace and muttered under his breath, "Dude, look at the window." I followed his gaze to the front window beside the door. There was a kink in the blinds, just a small fold pushed up slightly, and behind it, a hand. A man's hand. Someone was standing there, holding the blinds open just enough to peer through, watching us, silently, not moving, just staring. The edge of his face was barely visible behind the slats, his eyes locked on ours with no expression at all. George and I exchanged a glance and kept walking without saying another word. Once we were out of earshot, George finally said what we were both thinking. That was insanely creepy. And it was. We didn't know who the guy was, but we already had a pretty good feeling he wasn't going to be the best neighbor. That night, around 1 in the morning, I started hearing strange noises coming from outside. Not the usual city hum or passing cars. This was rhythmic, mechanical, repetitive, almost aggressive. Where we live, it's warm year-round, so the windows are usually open to let in the breeze, which meant the sound was coming in clearly, loud enough to wake me from a dead sleep. I got up and walked over to the window. My room's upstairs and has a pretty clear view of our neighbor's backyard, the same neighbor we'd had that awkward non-encounter with just days earlier. The noise was coming from there. I looked out and saw him for the first time. He was a big guy, broad shoulders, tall. He had the hood of a sweatshirt pulled over his head, which already felt strange considering it was a warm, humid night, maybe 72 degrees, the kind of night you'd sleep with just a sheet. But there he was, in the middle of his backyard, sawing away at a massive piece of wood. Under the pale wash of a motion light, the whole scene looked surreal, like something out of a dream, or a bad movie. A grown man in the middle of the night violently cutting into lumber for no obvious reason, alone, silent except for the rasp of the saw. I stood there for a few seconds just watching, trying to wrap my head around what I was seeing. Then I went down the hall and knocked on George's door. He opened it almost immediately. Apparently, the noise had woken him up too. "I've got work early," he said, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell is this guy doing?" We both agreed it was completely out of line. Who starts sawing wood in their backyard in the middle of the night? So we figured we'd go over, just politely ask him to stop. Since he was outside, we didn't bother with the front door. Instead, we walked over and knocked on the side gate that led into his backyard. The wooden boards echoed loudly under our knuckles. The sawing stopped instantly. Just stopped. We stood there in silence waiting, expecting the gate to creak open any second. Maybe an explanation. Maybe a sleepy apology. But it never opened. Nothing happened. After a minute, George looked at me, then back at the gate. We waited a little longer, but the backyard was quiet now. Whatever he'd been doing, he'd stopped. And honestly, that was good enough for us. So we turned around and walked back home, still not saying much. At least now we could try to get some sleep. It wasn't until a few nights later that we heard the noises again. I woke up in the middle of the night, groggy and disoriented, with a strange unease already gnawing at me. At first, I couldn't place the sounds, just faint, sharp bursts cutting through the quiet, muffled, repetitive, not like the sawing from before. Then I realized. They were screams. Not loud, but unmistakable. Muffled by walls maybe, but human, raw, desperate. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. My room overlooked the neighbor's backyard again, and sure enough, he was out there, moving quickly in a panic. I could just make out his figure under the motion light, hunched over, dragging something across the yard. I squinted, trying to focus, but I couldn't tell what it was. A tarp? A bag? It was big, heavy, and left a deep trail through the grass. Then he stopped. He looked up, right at me. For a second, we just stared at each other, me frozen at the window, him standing dead still in the yard, hood casting a shadow over his face. I ducked down immediately, heart pounding in my ears. I bolted out of my room and ran to George's door. He was already awake, just like last time. "The screaming," he said before I could even speak. His eyes were wide, his face pale. He grabbed his phone and called the police without hesitation, pacing in his doorway as he explained what we'd heard and what I'd seen. I stood right by the door, barely breathing, listening to him talk to the dispatcher, waiting, hoping to hear sirens. Then, suddenly, slam. A door slammed downstairs. It came from inside the house, the back door. George and I looked at each other, both frozen. We didn't speak, didn't move. The realization hit us both at the same time. He was in our house. George's voice rose in panic as he shouted into the phone, "He just came in! He's in our house! Send someone now!" While George stayed on the phone with the cops, I crept out of his room and made my way down the hallway toward the stairwell. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. I reached the top of the stairs and froze, straining to hear. Creaking. Slow, deliberate creaking from the floorboards downstairs. He was moving. I tiptoed backward, careful not to make a sound, and slipped back into George's room. I shut the door behind me as quietly as I could. "He's down there," I whispered. George was still on the phone with the dispatcher. "Have them come in through the back," he told her quickly, "right now." Then he hung up. There was no lock on his bedroom door, which suddenly felt like a terrifying oversight. So we pushed the small bookshelf and George's desk up against it, anything we could move, just in case. And not a moment too soon. Footsteps thundered up the stairs. fast, heavy. We heard the bathroom door fly open down the hall. Then footsteps again, this time heading straight for us. He slammed into George's door hard. The whole frame shook as the man on the other side tried to shove it open. We pushed back with everything we had, the furniture groaning beneath our weight. He rammed the door again, then again, each hit louder than the last. Then came the sound of something hard, metal or wood, slamming against the door. A blunt object. That was exactly why we didn't try to fight him off. We had no idea what kind of weapon he had, and we didn't want to find out. We gritted our teeth and held our ground, bracing against the door with every bit of strength we had. And after a while, an unbearable stretch of seconds that felt like hours, the banging stopped. Then, footsteps, going back down the stairs. Silence. We didn't move for what felt like forever. The air was thick, charged with the weight of what had just happened. Every muscle in my body was locked tight, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed. Finally, George and I exchanged a glance. Wordlessly, we moved the bookshelf just enough to crack the door open and peek into the hallway. Empty. He wasn't there. But we knew it wasn't over. Suddenly, a man's voice rang out from downstairs, deep, authoritative. "Police!" George and I bolted from the bedroom, stumbling down the stairs, adrenaline flooding our veins in pure relief. But when we reached the bottom of the staircase, something was wrong. There were no officers, no uniforms, no flashing lights, just silence. Until I saw him. Someone was crouched behind our dining room table, partially hidden in the shadows, just out of view. It was him. I didn't even have to say anything. I grabbed George's arm and hissed, "Run!" We tore back up the stairs, two at a time, and the man leapt from behind the table, charging after us without hesitation. This time, we didn't go for George's room. We sprinted for the bathroom, slammed the door, and locked it. It wasn't much, but at least it had a lock. We stood there, breathless, listening. Thud, thud, thud. He was back, pounding on the door. But before we could even think about what to do next, another voice echoed through the house. "Police! This is the police!" Only this time, it sounded real. The man at the door froze. Then, silence. George and I started shouting, "Up here! He's up here!" Within seconds, we heard boots pounding on the stairs. Two officers rushed up, weapons drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them barked. There was a pause, then the sharp clatter of a knife hitting the floor just outside the bathroom door. "It's safe. Come on out," one of them called. We unlocked the door and stepped out slowly, hearts still racing. The man, the neighbor, was face down in the hallway, handcuffed, surrounded by officers. His face was unreadable, cold. They hauled him outside and into the back of a police cruiser as more squad cars pulled up to the curb. George and I stood there, still trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "We heard screams," I told one of the officers. "From his house. You need to check his basement." Without a word, the officers nodded and approached the neighbor's house, guns drawn. Another cruiser pulled up. Then two more. A minute later, the front door of the house burst open, and what we saw next stopped us cold. Two officers emerged, supporting a woman who was crying uncontrollably, her face buried in her hands. Her legs were weak beneath her, barely able to carry her weight. She had been locked in the basement. They said she was pressed up against the inside of the basement door, screaming, trying to get out. And then came the worst part. There had been another body. The same one I'd seen being dragged through the backyard. The bag, the heavy shape. It was real. There was a dead body in that bag. We never found out the full story, who the woman was or who the victim had been. But whatever was going on in that house, it was something out of a nightmare, something that would stay with us forever. The man was arrested that night, and we're pretty sure he's never getting out, not after what they found. His house is back up for rent now, lights off, curtains drawn. And every time we pass it, we just hope that this time someone normal moves in, someone human.